I promised you guys I would get one, and while it isn't the 4GB model, I'll need a bit more time on that one, I do have AMD's brand new Radeon RX 9050, so the 8GB version. And boy, is this thing super duper stinky. It's really, really slow. A super bad value graphics card, but do not click away. You'll want to see just how bad it is. It's special, I promise. But before that, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Grizzly and their WireView Pro 2, the best way to safeguard your 12-volt high-powered connector from melting. This little device plugs in between your graphics card's power connector and the power supply's cable to measure current, voltage, temperatures, and the power of each individual pin. It has a built-in display with configurable views for per-pin current, total power, and temperature, plus audible and visual alarms if thresholds are exceeded. The CNC machined aluminium body includes a semi-passive fan for cooling, automatic data logging, and optional automatic system shutdown via the included splitter cable for extra safety. Grizzly are so confident that the WireView Pro 2 will keep your graphics card safe that they're backing the product with an extended warranty covering the GPU connector for 2 years. That is a crazy level of support, so for more information, please check the link in the video description. Okay, so right away, the elephant in the room, I don't have a 9050 in hand or anywhere on the desk here, and that's because I can't tell you which Radeon RX 9050 8GB model I have, so I can't show it. Now, it's a bit, you just have to take my word for it on this one. I do have one. I have tested it. This is all real. AMD just wouldn't provide me with a sample, and none of their partners were allowed to send me one. So we went through some side channels, got in contact with a few people, and we did manage to get one. But yeah, unfortunately, cannot show you the box, cannot show you the card. I can't even mention which model I have. They were all requests that were made by the people that sent it to me. So, you know, the RX 9050 is available at retail, but you can only purchase it in Latin America, Asia Pacific, and Japan regions, though Australia, part of the Asia Pacific region, Australia and Korea, they've been excluded. Now, look, I wouldn't be all that shocked if AMD excluded Australia just to try and dodge us, given how brutally we mugged the 6500 XT. I almost wouldn't blame them. In the end, AMD did basically beg us to stop beating up on the 6500 XT. I kid you not, AMD employees did reach out and asked if we could stop covering the 6500 XT. And of course we didn't, but that's pretty funny. They ended up getting us the 8GB version and asked if we could test that instead moving forward. And I said, yeah, sure. And then we managed to test both of them. Anyway, I'm sort of joking about the dodging thing. AMD did ask us to stop beating up the 6500 XT, which I find hilarious, but we'll move on from that. I don't think AMD avoided this entire continent of Australia just so we wouldn't review the RX 9050. But if they did, I guess the joke's on them because, as I said, we do have one. I just can't show it to you. So, what is the RX 9050 and why might you be getting the sense that perhaps I don't like it? There are 3 key issues with the RX 9050. There's a lot more than 3 issues, but let's go 3 key issues. So firstly, there's the performance, which is really bad. And that issue compounds with the second issue, which is the price. At $280 US, it's very expensive, of course, given the poor performance. But perhaps worst of all is the third issue, and that is that it shares the exact same product name with a broken 4GB version, packing just half as much VRAM, but also half as much memory bandwidth. It's a real doozy. In short, the 9050 is a binned 9060 XT. Apparently, AMD has quite a few broken 9060 XT dies that couldn't even be used as the standard 9060. You see, whereas the 9060 XT requires 2048 working cores, the vanilla 9060 requires just 1792. But that is a mountain of cores when compared to the 1024 featured in the 9050. And that means despite sharing the exact same silicon as the 9060 XT, the 9050 has half as many active cores. Now, according to the AMD reference spec, the 9050 cores also only clock as high as 2.6 GHz, whereas the 9060 XT cores will reach 3.1 GHz. Our particular model clocked between 2.7 and 2.8 GHz, which is still lower than the 9060 XT. So, given all of that, we'd expect the 9050 to be around 50% slower than the 9060 XT, which does mean it might struggle to compete with Nvidia's GeForce RTX 5050, as hard as that is to believe, but yeah, that could be the case. And given the specs, it certainly appears likely. All of that said, we should probably get on with the testing, so let's check out the operating behaviour, and then of course we'll jump into the blue bar graphs. After 30 minutes of load, installed in an ATX case with the doors on, inside a 21-degree room, the RX 9050 model that we have, which I can't name, saw a peak GPU hotspot temperature of just 59 degrees, though it did hit 66 degrees before the fans would actually turn on, but once the fans were spinning at a whisper quiet 960 RPM, mind you, the peak temperature was just 59 degrees. Also, as advertised, the card drew around 90 watts of power. We saw 92 watts for the peak, and the cores clocked at 2,770 MHz on average. Finally, the memory temperature peaked at just 56 degrees, so overall this is a very cool and quiet graphics card. Okay, so onto the blue bar graphs, and first up we have Clair Obscur Expedition 33, tested at 1080p using the Epic Quality preset, and here the RX 9050 averaged just 36 FPS. That did make it 38% faster than the aging RTX 3050 and 20% faster than the RX 6600. The RX 7600 though, it did edge past with 37 FPS, while the RTX 5050 took an 8% lead with 39 FPS. Meanwhile, stepping up to the RX 9060 XT 8GB yields a substantial 50% performance increase, pushing frame rates up to a much smoother 54 FPS average. At 1440p, the RX 9050 manages just 22 FPS on average, rendering it pretty unplayable. Interestingly though, it did manage to leapfrog several GPUs, outperforming both the RX 6600 and RX 7600, while also easily defeating the RTX 3050. It even managed to leave Nvidia's RTX 5050 behind, beating its 16 FPS average by 38%. Still, we are looking at unplayable frame rates, and that means you will need a far stronger GPU like the RX 9060 XT 8GB, which averaged 36 FPS. But that is a massive 64% performance increase over the 9050. Moving on to Marvel Rivals, we'll again start at 1080p with the Ultra preset. Here the RX 9050 delivered 41 FPS on average, falling short of a smooth 60 FPS experience. Still, that saw it outpace the older RTX 3050 by a 28% margin, while it comfortably beat the RX 6600 by 41%. Interestingly, it also managed to slightly edge out the older RX 7600's 40 FPS. However, Nvidia's RTX 5050 held a noticeable 22% lead with 50 FPS on average, and then for a far smoother experience, stepping up to the RX 9060 XT 8GB delivered 66 FPS on average. That represents a massive 61% performance increase over the 9050. Pushing the resolution up to 1440p brings Marvel Rivals down to a sluggish 27 FPS average on the RX 9050, and that makes upscaling pretty well mandatory here. It did still hold a 23% lead over the RTX 3050 and then 42% over the RX 6600. It also tied the RX 7600 frame for frame at 27 FPS, while Nvidia's RTX 5050 remained faster, outpacing the 9050 by an 11% margin with 30 FPS on average. Then, stepping up to the 9060 XT 8GB will provide a huge 70% performance increase, bringing performance up to a somewhat playable 46 FPS. Now in Star Wars Jedi Survivor, the RX 9050 delivered 57 FPS on average, so decent entry-level performance. And that saw it comfortably outperform the RTX 3050 by 27% and edge out the RX 6600 by a slim margin. The RTX 5050 and RX 7600 remained firmly ahead at 70 FPS and 72 FPS respectively, enjoying 23 to 26% greater performance. Then, moving up to the RX 9060 XT 8GB yields a huge 74% performance increase, reaching an impressive 99 FPS. Then when increasing the resolution to 1440p, this saw the RX 9050 average just 35 FPS. This did put it 30% ahead of the bottom tier GPUs like the RTX 3050 and then 6% clear of the RX 6600, but it cannot keep up with similar priced options. It trailed the RTX 5050 by 15% and the RX 7600 by 19%. And then upgrading to the RX 9060 XT 8GB results in an 80% performance increase, pushing the average to a much more enjoyable 63 FPS. Testing with a Plague Tale Requiem, we see that at 1080p using the Ultra settings, that the RX 9050 is good for 53 FPS. It does manage to flip the script on the older RX 6600, beating it by a slim 6% margin, and it easily crushes the RTX 3050's 38 FPS result. However, when stacked up against modern entry-level parts, it falls well behind. The RTX 5050 outpaced it by 15% with 61 FPS on average, while the older RX 7600 remains significantly faster with 65 FPS. And then once again, the step up to the 9060 XT 8GB is staggering. That GPU pushed 99 FPS, translating to a massive 87% performance increase over the 9050. Now increasing the resolution to 1440p, it becomes very clear that the Radeon RX 9050 8GB is completely out of its depth, at least when using the ultra quality settings. Here it managed just 32 FPS on average, so it's essentially unplayable. It barely edges out the aging RTX 3050, which sits at the bottom of our graph with just 27 FPS. What is concerning though is that it actually trailed the much older RX 6600 in average frame rate, though it does offer slightly better 1% lows at 28 FPS versus 26 FPS. The direct competition is not kind either. Nvidia's RTX 5050 comfortably beats it by 31% with 42 FPS on average, while the RX 7600 delivered 46 FPS. But for a genuinely playable 1440p experience, you do have to step up to the RX 9060 XT 8GB, which delivers a much smoother 69 FPS. Nice. That's a staggering 116% performance increase over the 9050, demonstrating a rather massive gulf in AMD's stack. Moving on to Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, we'll start with the 1080p data once again, this time using the slightly dialed down high preset, and here the RX 9050 did manage a smooth 67 FPS. It maintains a solid 31% lead over the RTX 3050 and it wound up 12% ahead of the RX 6600. Nvidia's RTX 5050 edged ahead by 7% with 72 FPS, while the RX 7600 managed to end up 21% faster with 81 FPS on average. Stepping up to the RX 9060 XT 8GB provides a huge 66% performance increase, soaring to 111 FPS on average, and that's a much better experience for those of you seeking high refresh rate performance on a budget. Then at 1440p, the RX 9050 averaged 44 FPS, and this gave it a healthy 38% performance advantage over the RTX 3050 and 22% over the RX 6600. That said though, it did fall behind modern entry-level competitors. For example, the RTX 5050 outpaced it by a 16% margin with 51 FPS, while the RX 7600 was 20% faster with 53 FPS. And then for those aiming for true 60 plus FPS performance at 1440p, the RX 9060 XT 8GB delivers 76 FPS on average, representing a massive 73% performance increase over the 9050. Spider-Man Remastered at 1080p using the very high quality preset allowed the RX 9050 8GB to sail comfortably past 60 FPS with 104 FPS on average, and that saw it hold a 33% performance advantage over the RTX 3050, while it beat the RX 6600 by 27%. In a surprising result, it even edges out the RX 7600 by 2%. However, Nvidia's RTX 5050 managed a 19% lead with 124 FPS, while the 9060 XT 8GB surged ahead with 182 FPS. That's a massive 74% performance increase over the 9050. Scaling up to 1440p, the RX 9050 stays above 60 FPS with a solid 65 FPS average, and that put it 16% ahead of the RTX 3050 and 33% clear of the RX 6600. However, the RX 7600 was faster here, outperforming the 9050 by 15% with 75 FPS, while the RTX 5050 led by 32% with 86 FPS. Meanwhile, upgrading to the RX 9060 XT 8GB yields an 86% performance increase, pushing frame rates up to 121 FPS. Moving on to Hogwarts Legacy. At 1080p, using the high preset, the RX 9050 averaged 56 FPS, falling just short of the 60 FPS mark. It managed a 19% advantage over the RTX 3050, and it effectively matched the RX 6600. Once again though, modern entry-level alternatives pull away significantly. For example, the RTX 5050 was 25% faster with 70 FPS on average, and the RX 7600 led by 36% with 76 FPS. The RX 9060 XT 8GB dominated with 105 FPS on average, offering an 88% performance increase. Then at 1440p, we see a significant strain placed on the lower-end hardware. Here the 9050 averaged just 43 FPS. It did manage a 19% lead over the RTX 3050, but it tied the old RX 6600 at 43 FPS, so not exactly impressive performance. And adding to that, Nvidia's RTX 5050 was 28% faster with 55 FPS, and the RX 7600 pulled ahead by a 37% margin with 59 FPS. And then if we step up to the RX 9060 XT 8GB, the performance increase here is particularly dramatic, delivering 84 FPS for a staggering 95% performance increase. In Starfield at 1080p with the ultra quality settings, the RX 9050 8GB delivered just 34 FPS on average. That did though see it hold a 21% lead over both the RTX 3050 and RX 6600, though I'm not sure that's particularly impressive, as those GPUs tied with just 28 FPS. Also, Nvidia's RTX 5050 was 21% faster with 41 FPS, while the RX 7600 pulled ahead significantly by a 41% margin. And then talking of significant performance increases, upgrading to the 9060 XT 8GB resulted in a 74% performance increase. That brought the average up to 59 FPS. Then at 1440p, the RX 9050 dropped to 26 FPS. It did manage an 18% performance lead over the RTX 3050, and it did stay 24% ahead of the RX 6600. The RTX 5050 though, that remained 23% faster with 32 FPS, while the RX 7600 reached 35 FPS for a 35% lead. And then stepping up to the 9060 XT 8GB once again delivers massive performance improvements. An 81% increase was seen in this example, averaging 47 FPS. Testing Stalker 2 at 1080p with the Epic preset proves to be extremely demanding. Here the RX 9050 managed a modest 33 FPS on average. This did match Nvidia's RTX 5050 frame to frame, while beating the RTX 3050 by 18% and the RX 6600 by 10%. The RX 7600 maintains a noticeable 27% lead though with 42 FPS. And then if we step up to the RX 9060 XT 8GB, we do see a 61% performance increase with 53 FPS on average. At 1440p, we do hit a VRAM wall. Nearly every 8GB or lower tier card completely collapses, with the RX 9050 8GB averaging an unplayable 8 FPS. The RTX 3050, RX 6600, RTX 5050, and RX 7600 all suffer a similar fate. Remarkably, even the 8GB version of the RX 9060 XT collapses to just 9 FPS, making its lead over the 9050 a meaningless 13%. Meanwhile, the 16GB RX 9060 XT cruises to 42 FPS, certainly not amazing performance, but much better than the 8GB version. Moving on to Space Marine 2, we'll once again start with the 1080p data, which is based on the Ultra preset. Here the RX 9050 averaged 56 FPS, placing it in a direct tie with Intel's Arc B580. It also delivered a 22% uplift over the entry-level RTX 3050 and holds an 8% edge over the older RX 6600. However, modern mid-range parts pull away significantly here. The RX 7600, for example, was 25% faster with 70 FPS, while the RTX 5050 claimed a 38% lead with 77 FPS. And then moving up to the RX 9060 XT 8GB, that allowed for a substantial 68% performance increase with 94 FPS on average. Upping the resolution to 1440p, we see that the RX 9050 drops to just 39 FPS. It did manage a 22% lead over the RTX 3050 and it beat the RX 6600 by 11%, but the newer competitors did extend their advantage. The RX 7600, for example, that managed 48 FPS, making it 23% faster, and the RTX 5050 hit 53 FPS to make it 36% faster. And then when we push up to the RX 9060 XT 8GB, we find an impressive 79% performance increase for a smooth 70 FPS. Finally, we have our 10-game average data, starting with the 1080p results. Here we see that the Radeon RX 9050 8GB sits firmly in entry-level territory with 49 FPS on average. Looking at the comparisons, it did manage a 23% lead over the aging RTX 3050, not exactly impressive, and then just 11% over the old RX 6600, which I'd say is very poor. And that's because when we compare with modern entry-level options, well, they were just far more impressive. For example, the RTX 5050 was 20% faster on average with 59 FPS, while the older RX 7600 outpaced it by 22% with 60 FPS on average. And for buyers considering staying within the Radeon ecosystem, the step up to the Radeon RX 9060 XT 8GB represents a massive 76% performance increase, pushing frame rates to a far more capable 86 FPS average. Overall, the 9050 lands near the bottom of the modern 1080p options. Looking at the 1440p 10-game average data, the RX 9050 averaged just 33 FPS, demonstrating that native 1440p is a tall order for this card, especially when using higher quality settings. Even so, it holds a massive 50% performance advantage over the bottom tier RTX 3050, and it wound up 27% clear of the older RX 6600. Again, neither of those matchups is particularly impressive, but that's where it stands. Interestingly, it did manage to match Nvidia's RTX 5050 frame for frame with 33 FPS, and it did stay somewhat close to the RX 7600, which leads by just 6% at 35 FPS. But upgrading to the 9060 XT 8GB yielded a substantial 61% performance increase, delivering a 53 FPS average. A saving grace of sorts for the Radeon RX 9050 could have been power consumption, but sadly no. If AMD had managed a 75W TDP, this graphics card could have been powered exclusively via the PCI Express slot, but that's not the case. Sadly, even at this performance level, the 9050 is a 92W part, so still very low powered, but it does require external PCIe power. In our testing, when combining PCIe and EPS power draw, we saw around 180 watts used by the RX 9050 configuration, which is around 80 watts less than the ARC-B 580 and RTX 4060 Ti, for example. So it does sip power, but it's also really slow, so it's not exactly exciting stuff. Now, as I noted at the start of this review, the big issue for the RX 9050 is the combination of really poor performance with a relatively high price. And this is best illustrated by this graph. I mean, wow, thanks AMD, what would budget gamers have ever done before they had the option of buying an RX 9050? Now look, some will argue that it's good AMD released a super low tier RDNA 4 graphics card. This is what budget gamers need after all. And while I do agree we need more affordable graphics cards for budget gamers, it very much defeats the purpose if the new products are only as good, or in this case, worse, than the existing products that we already had. For example, the GeForce RTX 5060, it wasn't exactly amazing, even at its launch MSRP of $300 US, and at $460, it's a joke. Disgustingly bad, and yet somehow the RX 9050 is only able to roughly match its value. Then we have the RX 5050. That was an even bigger joke. It's meant to cost $250 US, but currently costs $320 US, and in our review we called the 5050 e-waste. So given that, I'm not sure what to make of the even slower and worse value RX 9050. And sure, the GeForce GPU is technically more expensive, but at a $40 US premium, it's not significantly more so. But even cheaper than the RTX 5050 is Intel's ARC-B 580 at $310, Not only do you get a more appropriate amount of VRAM with 12GB, but it's also 27% faster than the RX 9050, coming in at just over 10% better value per frame. And then there's AMD's own Radeon RX 9060 XT 8GB, and look, sure, it is quite a bit more at $400, and I don't expect everyone will be able to come up with that extra $120 US, but that's also not the point. The point is, you're getting absolutely screwed if you can't come up with the extra money, as the 9060 XT is around 20% better value. So there you have it. AMD's doing budget gamers no favours with the RX 9050. If anything, they might as well just be spitting in their faces. The performance is horrible for a current generation product, and the value, somehow, is even worse. Realistically, for this product to make any kind of sense, it really does need to be priced at most $200 US. I don't really care how much VRAM costs right now. It needs to make sense in the current market, and at $280 US, the Radeon RX 9050 makes no sense, and therefore, it need not exist. We're also comparing the $280 US MSRP with the real retail pricing of existing GPUs. So if the RX 9050 ends up coming in at, say, $300 or possibly more, it's going to be an even bigger disaster. And it really does annoy me that those on the tightest of budgets are getting screwed the hardest by AMD and Nvidia. So really all you can do is not buy these trash tier products, and that is my advice. Sadly though, the RX 9050 8GB isn't even close to being the bad news of this release. Believe it or not, this is actually the good model. Really good when compared to the OEM only version that AMD has confirmed will be shipping in at least one pre-built PC. Despite sharing the exact same product name, the RX 9050 will have a 4GB OEM version with not just half the VRAM, but also half the memory bandwidth, and that means the performance is going to be absolutely abysmal. And even worse than that, I imagine it will be sold for around $250 US, though I can't confirm this, it's just an educated guess, but it's not going to be anywhere near cheap enough. Anyway, I plan on doing whatever it takes, even if I have to fly across the earth to get it. I will at some point benchmark the 4GB 9050 XT. For now though, that is our review of the horrible Radeon RX 9050 8GB. Obviously don't buy this thing, either shop secondhand or look at products like the ARC B580, or save up for a 9060 XT, ideally the 16GB model if you can. And if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, subscribe, do all the YouTube related stuff. And if you want more Hardware Unboxed goodness, we do have the join button or Patreon. Sign up to either one of those things. We'll give you exclusive access to our Discord server, monthly live streams, Q&A stuff, and behind the scenes content. So check that out if you're interested. If not, that's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.